Preserving the Union or uniting Ireland? The debate rumbles on. But who's winning the propaganda war? Welcome to The View. Tonight, the constitutional question is never far from the headlines, and the fight to win votes for a border poll is underway. We've been to Coleraine to hear from people determined to protect the Union.
That generation need to be taught that being part of the UK is important.
It's not just clear black and white, green or orange, you know, that this is something good about the place where you're living.
I've been speaking to the two men making the case to maintain the status quo despite other competing voices.
He said, I love Ireland's future. Ireland's future are bad at what they do. Do you really believe that?
Yes. Ireland's future are a PR campaign. Public relations campaigning and political campaigning are two different things.
But that's just one view. Back in the studio, we'll hear a broad range of opinions on the constitutional future of this place. Hello. In many ways, Professor Pete Shirlow and Lee Reynolds make an unusual political couple. The pair are touring Northern Ireland with their roadshow, talking up the strength of the Union. We'll hear from them both shortly, but first I went along to their recent event in Coleraine to gauge reaction to their message.
Someone who identifies as British or Unionist is more likely to vote. So getting people to identify with those things is a positive and will deliver at the ballot box.
Essentially, what we're involved in is this propaganda war. Facts do not cease to exist simply because somebody ignores them.
I think there's two conversations to be had here. I think there's unions who need to be told the facts about Northern Ireland. I think there has been, as I said before, there has been a bit of negativity about Northern Ireland, and people listen to the media, they listen to the news, and there has been this kind of diet of, you know, Northern Ireland is on a bad track, you know, United Ireland's around the corner, and I think the facts actually speaks to a different truth to that. So I think tonight is about reinforcing that message.
These were people who were coming along who didn't know what they were going to hear, but what they heard was something that they hadn't heard before, which is a positive story of this place, how the economy is doing well. We're nearly at full employment here. Yes, we have issues, but those issues, there are solutions, and the challenge is that we need now a politics that's actually going to make politics work for the benefit of all the people.
I have a 22-year-old daughter who's not remotely interested in anything to do with this. So she's voted. She's voted twice now since she turned 18. I'm not going to obviously say who she voted for, but she's that middle of the road one that doesn't want anything to do with it, and I think that generation need to be taught that being part of the UK is important.
We have some friends who would be disinterested, perhaps is maybe a good word at putting us in, maybe not negative, but just turned off by it. And there is a positive story to tell, and it's that inclusiveness that sometimes we have been the worst possible conveyor of what unionism or belonging to the UK is really about and can really offer. And I think, as was said more than once tonight, we need to change our attitude, be a bit more embracing than we have been in the past, and there's different shades of unionism.
I've known quite a few politicians, and they've also told me that although they can try to give positive messages and to get the message out there, that sometimes that message is very difficult to get out into the media. So I don't think we can put all the blame on political unionism. I think that we as members of the community need to ourselves spread that message and get more people aware of how positive things are.
If people have a negative attitude towards Northern Ireland or being British or part of the United Kingdom, that you'll be able to share with them, well, did you know that such and such a thing is happening, and that, you know, it's not just clear black and white, green or orange, you know, that this is something good about the place where you're living and where you're working, where you have your life every day. And I won't use it in a sermon, obviously, because I'm a clergywoman, but I will keep that back. Yeah.
Well, the two men who led the charge at this week's Co-RIN event are the Director of the University of Liverpool's Institute of Irish Studies, Professor Pete Shirlow, and the former DUP Special Advisor and Belfast City Councillor Lee Reynolds. When I sat down with them to discuss their sense of how best to defend the union, I began by asking Professor Shirlow for his thoughts on how the event had gone.
Well, this is a series of events that we've undertaken, and the result is the same every time. People walk out of the room in a much more confident place. People walk out of the room saying they knew some of this, they didn't know some of this. They most certainly walk out of the room and all of them basically ask the question, why are unionist politicians not saying this? Why aren't they talking positively about the economy? Why aren't they talking positively about the changes that have taken place in this society? So I think what's interesting is, you know, people are coming in who clearly wouldn't vote for United Ireland, but when they come in, you know, maybe some of them have lack of vocabulary to express that, or they, you know, when they meet Republicans or those who are pro-unity, they don't know what to say. And it seems to me what this is, with all of this data we're talking about is fact-checked. All of this comes from respectable resources. And I think in many ways it gives them a capacity to have conversations with those who disagree with them in a manner which basically gives them some capacity to challenge what they're hearing.
So Lee, if what Pete says is right, that must hint at a weakness, maybe even a failure on the part of political unionism to effectively communicate its message to its core supporters.
Yes, the figures are clear. Unionism is underperforming. Its potential amongst the electorate, as clearly demonstrated by referendum poll after referendum poll, they have space to grow, and what they're doing at the moment isn't working. So therefore they have to challenge themselves and look how they operate, look how they look what they're saying, look how they behave, and modernise and adapt.
It's an odd thing though, isn't it, that people come into a room saying, I'm here because I'm a unionist and I want to hear about the unionist message, but I need to be educated about some of the core facts about why remaining in the United Kingdom makes sense. You'd think if they were unionists that would be part of their DNA.
Well, because it's part of the DNA, you sometimes don't then need the art. You know, it's basically, this is what you are, you know, you don't need the detail, just carry on. The world's changed a bit more. They do need the detail. They do need they do need to make the case and understand the case and help communicate the case to the next generation as well. So it just has, if unionism isn't great on activism and isn't great on political education, and things like that have got to change.
Yeah, and you said education is absolutely key in unionism moving forward. But look, I'm not going to say that what you were saying tonight was simplistic or simple or straightforward. It wasn't. But it is stuff that if you read the papers and watched, you know, political programmes, listened to the radio, you would be familiar with.
Yeah, but we've got to be very careful here, okay? We've talked tonight about the term unionism, okay? People who would vote to stay in the union wouldn't call themselves unionists, okay? So it's not just an education process internally, it's actually a broader conversation. One is, there are people who are not going to vote unionist but who would vote pro-union in a referendum. There are also people out there who aren't really thinking about this very much, or if they do think about it, they don't really have much information with which to actually have that conversation. So the messages here tonight are quite key, okay? Lee's talk is really an internal conversation within unionism about what it needs to do, how it needs to operate, how it needs to move on. What I'm talking about are facts and figures and data which challenge many of the things that you would encounter in social media or that you would encounter amongst those who are pro-Irish unity. Everybody in this room knows there are people who go out and vote for United Ireland and there are people who go out and vote for the staying in the Union, and they don't care if it makes society better or worse in terms of well-being, etc. Okay, but we're living in a much more sophisticated society, and there, especially amongst young people, they will actually engage in any conversation that happens in the future about this issue. They will engage in this in pounds, shillings, and pence because they're not steeped in republicanism. They're not steeped in unionism.
One of the key aims of tonight was debunking myths, presumably one of the key myths that you were endeavouring to debunk is, from your perspective, that Irish unity is inevitable. You talked about that quite a lot tonight. That suggests that it is an issue that concerns you.
One of the things we touch on is psychology and the impact of it, and the ability for one community to get in somebody else's head, and that then leads to people not concentrating on what they need to be doing. They get distracted. So part of it is to basically, look, you're hearing this is actually wrong, but it's there to distract you from what you need to be doing. Get on with what you need to be doing.
In fact, you said tonight, and one of the points that you made was get the provos out of your head.
Yes. That's psyops. Terrorism is psyops. They're very good at getting into your head. If you allow your opponent in your head, you're reacting to them. You're not focusing on what you need to do. So that's what that point is about. We cannot control what our opponents are going to do. We can only control what we do. So stop worrying about them and worrying about what we need to be doing and what we need to be getting on. And if we do, we will be on an upward path.
You were, presumably quite deliberately provocative in some of what you said tonight. I made a few notes. You said, I love Ireland's future. Ireland's future are bad at what they do. Do you really believe that?
Yes. Ireland's future are a PR campaign. Public relations campaigning and political campaigning are two different things. So they're not a serious political campaign.
Ireland's future would say it's shaping the public conversation, and it is getting people to think in this post-Brexit era about the possibility of constitutional change in numbers that they maybe didn't do before.
But if that was the case, Mark, can you show where the impact is in elections or surveys? If somebody is claiming that they're shaping something, you'd expect an outcome. So
one of the outcomes is that it's been talked about in the public square more than it has been in the past. But okay, well, let's talk about the recent...
Can I give you an analysis of what you're doing? There's a good book by an American political scientist called Seth Hill, where he talks about frustrated majorities. That basically a very proactive minority position in a democratic system can get more attention and more action than it legitimately deserves in terms of public support. That's essentially where we're at, and that's essentially the role that Ireland's future is playing.
Okay, but you also need to avoid complacency, presumably, if you want to sell the message of why the connection with the United Kingdom continues to be important. And if you look at the first results of this year's North and South research, which was reported recently in the Irish Times, there were a couple of messages. One is that the test laid down in the Belfast Agreement for a border poll isn't about to be met. The second point is that the pro-union majority in Northern Ireland has decreased in the 3 years since the series began, and it's decreased fast. And the gap between the unionist and pro-unity sides in the north, as measured by the first survey back in 2022, was 21 percentage points, 50% in favour of maintaining the union to 27% for Irish unity, and this year it's 48 to 34, which is just 14 points. So if you want to look at direction of travel, there's direction of travel, Ireland's future might say.
There are issues with that polling. Firstly, the basis of the 2022 survey and the subsequent two are different. They've used a different weighting system beneath it, so you can't compare 2022 to 2024. Then if you actually look at the 2024 one, they have a massive oversampling of nationalism. They find 3 nationalist voters for every 2 unionist voters. You can solve that with weighting. When you then go to their weighting, they weighted that there are more nationalist voters than unionist ones. So I'm saying that I wouldn't be investing overly in the results of that particular result.
Okay, and there's nobody from Aaron's here or the Irish Times to defend the sampling, and I'm not going to do that. What I would say is it's been widely picked up upon and widely reported. I just would point out one thing, that the academics responsible for this survey point out in their analysis of the numbers that if the gap continues to close at the rate of the last 3 years, the pro-union majority will be gone by 2027. Even if you don't entirely trust the figures, you've got to take the possibility that they might be right seriously, do you not?
No, because what you do is I do these surveys as well, okay? I've done a lot of these surveys. My colleague John Tong and I have done these surveys, okay? Nobody is finding what they have found. That's the first thing. So, you have to compare with other surveys that have been done. There is no evidence in any election result that has been an outcome or that is a direction of travel. And I think one of the things you're talking about here, they talk about a 9% shift in this survey, I think, over 3 years. That's 90 people. That's 90 people out of a survey of 1,000.
You both talked tonight at some considerable length about the growth in the middle ground. And again, you touched on the idea that unionism needs to be as broadly attractive as possible to try to keep as many people on side supporting the connection with the UK as possible in the long term. And here's something you might disagree on, and that's Brexit and the role that Brexit has had in recent years in Northern Ireland. Because there is now a narrative that says perhaps things in the Republic of Ireland are more attractive on this side of Brexit than they were beforehand, and there is a narrative that may take us in this direction. And you were anti-Brexit. Do you see that point? Do you see the validity in that point?
Oh, we certainly did see it, because when we were doing our surveys, Brexit clearly decreased the share of people who wanted to stay in the Union and increased the share of people who wanted Irish unity. Clearly, for cultural Catholics in particular, that this was something that was said to them a sense of betrayal. That the border, the conversation we had about hard borders, etc. It clearly provoked a reaction. It clearly created amongst some people this sense of, here comes perfidious Albion again. In Great Britain they voted one way, but we voted a different way, and we're ending up, being dominated by that relationship. Of course it had an impact, but it certainly hasn't had the impact since. Plus, what we have to factor in, there's things here that have also changed since Brexit. You now have the most pro-union parliament with the decline of the SNP. You've got the most pro-union parliament for a very significant period of time. What you also have, hopefully, is a Labour government which is going to deal with Europe in a much more mature and pragmatic way. A Republican can sit and tell you about all these positive things about the South. I can tell you negative things about the South. A Republican can tell you negative things about the North, and I can tell you positive things about the North. But that conversation is not about building anything. That conversation is just chalk and cheese and black and white. What we're talking about tonight is a much broader conversation about how you build a better society.
It might shape the opinions of those people in the middle ground upon whom unionism increasingly seems to depend. I mean, can you now say that perhaps the Brexit vote, having gone the way it went, hasn't helped Northern Ireland's place in the Union?
I believe the UK leaving the European Union was the best decision for the UK.
Do you still think that now, Lee?
For the UK, yes. I regret that the UK has decided to do nothing with it. And I certainly am not happy with how Northern Ireland's ended up in that process. But this is where you also have to be careful with the numbers. And this is the thing of, there was an anger factor. And people have responded in a particular way because the UK leaving the European Union, they believe, impacted upon them. If you're talking about abolishing Northern Ireland, if you're talking about Northern Ireland leaving the United Kingdom, it's Brexit time 1,000. So even somebody who I think may have been angered about Brexit, I think when if it actually came down to the referendum debate, their anger about Brexit would soon disappear whenever the realities of abolishing Northern Ireland were made clear to them.
It's a complex conversation, but are you both optimistic about the future for unionism?
Yes, because we have a host of opportunities in front of us. Now, where we cannot be complacent is we have opportunities in front of us. We need to take them. We need to get on with taking them. The fact that we have events, that people are turning up, that they're leaving enthused, I think shows that we have something. Now, none of us are egotistical to think that basically we are too many messiahs that have all the answers. We're not in any shape, form or fashion. But what I can say to any politician of any party, that I would describe the reaction of the audiences who've turned up, that there is at least a hunger for something different and something more than is presently being offered. Now, if other people want to enter the debate of what that different could be, we'd more than welcome them. But basically, I do think there is an untapped market out there.
It's the old Desmond Tutu line when somebody said to him, Archbishop, you're always optimistic. He said, no, I'm not always optimistic. I believe in hope. And I think one of these things this event does is for people who feel insecure, is it's giving them something to go away and think about, which I assume is giving them a bit more. If they have fears or anxieties about the future, it's making them realise that there are arguments that they could make, there are arguments that others could make that would build that sense of hope and take them from a very, very different place.
Pete Shirlow and Lee Reynolds. So where does that pro-union narrative sit within the wider debate on the constitutional future of the island? I'm joined now by Mark Hennessy from the Irish Times, who's written widely on the issue. Duncan Morrow is a professor of politics at Ulster University. Professor Colin Harvey is a board member of Ireland's Future, and Ian Marshall is a former member of the Irish Senate who stood for the Ulster Unionist Party in last year's general election. We're also joined from Dublin by the novelist and newspaper columnist Martina Devlin. Welcome to all of you, and thanks very much for being with us tonight. Mark Hennessy, first of all, you were at the event in Coleraine earlier in the week, listening carefully to what Pete and Lee had to say and to the reaction to it. What's your sense of, first of all, what it was that the members of the public who were there heard that sent them off in such positive spirits?
Well, I think people came to the meeting with a sense of despair about the lack of leadership within unionism and in political unionism. And there's no doubt that the presentation by Peter Shirlow and Lee Reynolds was at what they were trying to do was superbly done. It was optimistic, it was filled with detail, and it worked from the point of view of the audience. I think, judging by the people I spoke with, I think many people went away with a sense that, yes, they'd heard some positive messages, although you would wonder why they're not picking up some of that from their normal media consumption. So there's a disengagement there going on. But I think it sent quite a few of them away with a question mark over why their own political parties are failing so miserably to put forward the case that was made as eloquently as it was made by the two speakers. We can criticise particular elements of detail or whatever else, but as a production, that was a good night's work by both of them.
And we'll tease out a bit more on that throughout the course of this conversation, but something else we just need to deal with, I think, at this point, get it out of the way. I don't want to get caught in the crossfire between academics on the results of their respective polling, but the Irish Times is a partner with Irons in its ongoing research project. You saw there the criticisms levelled by Pete and Lee at the methodology employed. We asked the Irons academics to respond to that criticism. We received a very lengthy 3-page letter which explains in detail how the results were arrived at and concludes that they are, and I quote, confident that our surveys appropriately capture the political landscape in Northern Ireland, notably the underlying divide between unionists and nationalists. So that's a rejection of the criticism. What's your response to what was said by them in Coleraine?
Well, my response it goes back to a certain extent to what Lee said when he was talking about how unionists are making the mistake of, in psychological warfare, of allowing Republicans inside their head. They now seem to have Aaron's and the Irish Times inside their head. We stand over the figures. We've given a very detailed reply to you, which we stand over. And quite frankly, we're doing this research every year, and come back to us in 12 months.
OK. Let's move on to Professor Colin Harvey. Lee Reynolds was straight talking about your organisation there in what he had to say about Ireland's future. He said it's a PR campaign, not a serious political campaign. What's your response to that?
Well, first of all, really appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight and really wish Pete and Lee well in their initiative. I think it's a very welcome initiative that they're taking, but in some senses it proves the point of the success of Ireland's Future. And what I would ask people to do is, I'm a board member of Ireland's Future, to judge the organisation on the work that it has actually done. And I would point people to the website, irelandsfuture.com, the extensive range of publications on the economy, on healthcare, on the constitutional future, a range of very, very substantial policy papers. Everybody's well aware of our major events that have been held all over Ireland and internationally, that have attracted thousands and thousands of people into this space and this conversation. We have had people from political parties across the island of Ireland, from civic society, from the trade union movement, academics. Let me put it very, very clearly. If you put a professor of law, a professor of political science, and a professor of economics in the SSE arena on a Saturday afternoon in June, that's not a PR exercise. Anybody who's been to our events know that Ireland's Future is a serious organisation. The people we deal with are serious.
It is a PR campaign if it doesn't move the dial and gain traction on shaping the debate. Now, I put it to him that that's what you're trying to do, but his riposte to that was that there's no evidence of you actually making any difference.
There's crystal clear evidence. First of all, the initiative that Lee and Peter are involved in is evidence of the need to defend the Union, which I wish them well in doing.
Do you think it's a reaction to the success of Ireland's future?
It's absolutely a reaction to the success of Ireland's future. Ireland's future has moved the conversation about constitutional change into the mainstream of public life on the island of Ireland and beyond. And I have to say, has often been quite modest in seeking recognition for that. But it has done that, and it's a serious organisation that has involved serious people in its work. And I'd also like to take the opportunity, as a member of the advisory board of the Ireland's Project, to defend the academic rigour and credibility of the work that's been done within that Ireland's Project. There's the survey work and the deliberative forums with Irish Times,
and we've
but
heard
there's
from
a
Aaron's,
whole range of other academic outputs that they have published and other work too that are seriously moving the dial on the conversation. And the polling confirms the trend is upward, the gap is narrowing. People want to see planning happening now.
And that may be the case, but the most recent Aaron's survey suggests here in Northern Ireland, support for Irish unity is at 34%. The status quo is 48%. That's people who don't want any change, and 14% of people said they don't know. So you're far away from the 50% that you would need to actually deliver constitutional change. I mean, that's the bottom line.
The polling is incredibly encouraging. Think about what the polling is telling us. Over a third of people in Northern Ireland would vote for constitutional change now. A solid majority of people would vote for constitutional change in the South now. And that's before we even get into proper campaigning and debate. So I think that is actually quite remarkable, and the trend is upwards. The focus at the moment, Mark, is planning and preparing well, of doing the work. You know, people take this seriously. They know what's at stake. That's why there's so much emphasis on getting this right. I think this is the direction of travel. All the trends are pointing in this direction, and I think Ireland's future, like others, like Oran's, like the Shared Island Unit, like the New Ireland Commission, like the Commission for the Future of Ireland Sinn Féin, everybody's trying to do the right thing to get the preparation done now.
OK, Ian Marshall, you're on the progressive wing of unionism. You served in the Seanad from 2018 to 2020. So we know that very, very few unionist voters support Irish unity. But what do you make of the Aaron's findings that 49% of unionists feel it's important to plan for the possibility of a united Ireland?
I welcome the work from the Aaron's Project, but I think like lots of these surveys, we need to caveat and be very careful, because people look at surveys and see that information and pick up different messages. So we've heard about 34% that are in support of unity, but many people will look at this and see that for them means that 66% of people aren't. So I think that the nervousness by political unionism and many in civic unionism is if they engage in a conversation, there's some people that will spin that and portray that as an acceptance, as this is a fait accompli, when what the Coleraine meeting has demonstrated is that when you bring groups of people, like-minded people together to talk about this, what you find very quickly is that most people in unionism, and arguably for nationalism, don't wake up in the mornings and talk about the constitutional question.
Do you think Colin Harvey's right when he says unionists actually should engage in the conversation and would be welcome to engage in the conversation? Because it's pretty clear that most unionists at this stage certainly don't want to do that. Is that a mistake?
Well, I think the mistake is that there hasn't been a space created for unions to have a conversation, because first thing is, if you create a conversation which is about unity, then that doesn't create a space, because that for lots of people is an anathema to them and is something that they feel they can't.
And what do you make of the charge there, the statement from Colin Harvey that, in his view, the work that Lee Reynolds and Pete Shirley were doing is clearly, he says, a response to the success of Ireland's future? Is that how you see it?
No, I think the work that they've done is an acknowledgement and a recognition that lots of people within unionism don't really or can't put their finger on what is good about the union, because it's something they've grown up with, and they've never interrogated that question or asked the question. Because when you look at when people are asked what's good about the union, the stock answer you get from many people is it's the NHS, when we all know that the NHS is under immense pressure and not working as we'd like it. So I think what they're doing is creating a space for people who are supporters of the union to have that conversation, to flesh out, OK, so what are the good things? And then sometimes when you encourage that conversation, people say, oh, we didn't realise that. And I think that's the important part of it.
OK, but you're not worried that Colin Harvey's got it right, that the direction of travel is now clearly in the direction of constitutional change?
Well, I think the direction of travel isn't clear now. And the reason I say that, Mark, is because you have three large blocks, 40, 40, 20. You have some shifts. There's a 3% margin of error in most of these surveys. We're looking at things, and I think Mark's work actually indicated that post-Brexit there was a shift. With the Windsor framework, there was a shift. We have a Trump administration now. There might be a financial shock, an economic shock south of the border. That may create another shift. So I don't think there's a clear direction of travel.
Although you know, the Irish Times did report that, according to the Aaron's Project academics, if the gap between those who support change and those who support the status quo continues to close at the rate of the last 3 years, the pro-union majority will be gone by 2027. That's 2 years' time.
Yeah, but I think people asked the question in a survey about their support for union or the unity. It's a very, very clearly defined question. It's a very, very hard one to answer. I
need to bring in Martina Devlin, who's joining us from Dublin now. Martina, thanks very much indeed. I hope you've managed to hear everything that we've heard from our guest in Belfast so far.
And greetings from Dublin.
Welcome to the programme. Thanks very much indeed. What, Martina, is your assessment of where the constitutional debate sits in the Republic at this stage? Is it as vocal as it was, for example, in the immediate aftermath of Brexit, would you say?
No. The North isn't high on the agenda because Stormont is functioning. That's the situation currently. And I mean, there's a lot going on globally with a new world order taking shape. I mean, in theory, all the parties in the Republic are in favour of unity, but actions speak louder than words, and there's not a lot of action currently. But that could change. Before I get to the change, I should say that Micheál Martin is all about the shared island unit, which is a don't frighten the horse's name. It's clever phraseology because it moves away from a united Ireland to a shared island, and it suggests gradual evolutionary change rather than anything too startling, which really appears to be the preferred view in the upper echelons of the Irish government. And that's a relatively conservative position. But the programme for government for the new coalition has committed an additional €1 billion to the Shared Island Fund up to the year 2035. And that is not disinterest. The Irish government is engaged in consistent and, quite productive soft diplomacy. It's pumping money northwards, including into loyalist areas. And, residents in those communities know the funds they're quite reliant on now don't originate with Westminster, which has long since lost interest in Northern Ireland. So, to the question of whether there might be a boost in interest generally in the Republic, that could change with the presidential election in November. There's a vacancy in Áras an Uachtaráin then, and so the election will run in October.
And do you think that will spark a serious debate about constitutional change at that point?
It could do. I mean, it's hard to predict, but what I would say is the incoming president could potentially serve for 14 years, and she or he must be able to engage constructively with unionism. And some people feel there may be a case to be made for the candidate to be from the north or from the border area or have strong links with and interest in the north. And if you look ahead to the next 15 years, the constitutional position may move towards a realignment. I mean, a border poll is not unlikely in that time frame, but in any event, the two parts of the island will grow closer in terms of mutual interests and cooperation. And there is a view that it's essential to have a constructive individual in the Phoenix Park, a bridge builder who can reach out to unionism and connect with it.
OK, let's bring in Professor Duncan Morrow here in Belfast. Just to pick up on what Martina was saying about the possibility of the presidential debate later this year in the Republic sparking a conversation about this. Do you think that that's likely to happen? Is that the kind of thing that could, the kind of event that could be a bit of a game changer here?
Listen, we have seen trends be trends until they stop being trends. And actually they usually stop because events outside of Northern Ireland or broader take place. So the election in the South, if it had gone the other way, would have given us a different conversation than the one we have now. The Brexit conversation is over. We've now got a global challenge which may change the relationship of Britain and Ireland. A presidential election in the South is another event which may change the way that debates are discussed. I think what for me is coming across here is there is absolutely nothing which is fixed in this conversation. But what is absolutely clear for those who don't take an automatic position is that at the moment in Northern Ireland, I think their focus is on, can we get government to work? Not should there be a referendum. And there's an awful lot of noise around this discussion between the people who feel it passionately. But the people who don't feel it passionately, I think, are more worried about the health service. I think they're more worried about the fact that government is not delivering for them.
I think I've mentioned the Aaron's project in association with the Irish Times a number of times on the programme already. I should just explain for the benefit of people who don't know that Aaron stands for Analysing and Researching Ireland North and South, and it's in association with the Royal Irish Academy in Dublin and the University of Notre Dame in Dublin, just in case you're not fully aware of that. But you get a lot of information about that project in the Irish Times on a fairly regular basis. You've talked a lot about the centre ground and the importance of the centre ground, and I just want to focus on that for a moment or two now, Duncan. Both unionists and nationalists look at the persuadables, the undecideds, the don't knows, won't says as rich pickings. Do you think they can be swayed by the debate that takes place in the next few years to the point that everything potentially is up for grabs?
I think that they are looking for somebody who's offering them a plural, open and a future which is peaceful. Actually, whoever does that will win that conversation. But in the meantime, they want to see it being demonstrated inside actually Northern Ireland. There is, as I pick up among the centre ground, a drive to a referendum, and that I agree with Pete and Lee. But on the other hand, I think they don't want to be taken for granted in any referendum if a campaign were to take place. So I wouldn't want to say which way they would vote, because that would depend on the campaign and it would depend on what the offers were.
Colin Harvey, what did you make of Dr. Martina Devlin's point there, that effectively what you've got in the Republic now is a new government, a new administration, which doesn't include Sinn Féin, which of course drove the issue of a united Ireland, constitutional change during the election campaign along with the Labour Party, but neither of them have got into government. So you've now got a Taoiseach and a Taoiseach in place who are more focused on a shared island than they are on a united Ireland. I mean, that's the reality that you're dealing with at the moment.
I suppose a starting point, Mark, is I don't draw a distinction between those two concepts. We're talking about how we're going to share the island in the future, which is envisaged in the Good Friday Agreement. So I don't see the distinction.
But they're not talking about constitutional change. They're not talking about border polls.
The momentum around this conversation has attraction now of its own, I think. So I see the shared island concept as very much part of that.
Unionists will take that as meaning that it's a Trojan horse.
We're talking about sharing the island better now. And when we look at the Good Friday Agreement, we're talking about how we're going to share, or how we may share the island in the future. It would be silly not to prepare for that. I think it has traction. I think the focus of the next few years will be building a broad political and civic coalition around this. I think momentum is building around that. I think many people find it rather odd that the Irish government are sidestepping it for now, although some of the funding that's involved is not unhelpful to this conversation.
Yeah.
But my view is the Irish government will get there eventually, and the shared island concept includes this conversation.
But you know that there will be unionists watching this, one of them sitting beside you, and I'll hear from him in a second, who will say, look, we're more than happy to share the island. We do share the island. We're very happy to take money from the Irish government for infrastructure projects north of the border. But because we're happy to share the island doesn't mean we're happy to unite the island or design and agree and sign up to something that you would call a new Ireland. They're two separate things for unionists.
I take you back to something you mentioned earlier, the idea of inevitability. And I'd like to share, so I don't see this as inevitable. What I do see inevitable is choice, right? So the Good Friday Agreement says there are two options really for the future here, the union with Britain or United Ireland. People have a choice that gets waved in their faces every day. So what we're talking about is the inevitability of that choice happening. And then it'll be up to people to put their manifestos, their programmes, their perspectives out there. But I think increasingly what the evidence says in terms of basic bread and butter issues is that constitutional change is the better bet and the better option of bringing this region fully also back within the European Union framework.
Okay, so Ian Marshall, how do you respond to that? A shared
island is not really any different from constitutional change?
Well, I think you covered it yourself, Mark. It's fundamentally different. Sharing an island...
The man sitting beside you says it's not.
It's how we may share the island in the future. How we may share it in the future.
Sharing an island is about building bridges, about linking communities, about building relationships. And that starting point, that's something completely different to the question of constitutional change. Most people within unionist circles will be very comfortable and happy to work north-south and east-west and share.
OK, we're nearly out of time, but I want to try and squeeze as many of you in as I can before we have to pull the shutters down. Shared Ireland versus United Ireland, New Ireland, Mark?
They're completely different things, certainly in the eyes of the Taoiseach. He started this, 6 years ago with very small money, deliberately very small money, so that it wouldn't frighten horses. Very unpopular with many people within Fianna Fáil who wanted something much more ambitious. There is a change in language coming from people on the pro-unity campaign who were previously, not Colin, with respect, but there were others who were dismissive of shared Ireland. But because there is so little happening on the unity question in Dublin now, there will be a drive to actually big up shared Ireland as being something in many ways that it never was intended to be. Shared Ireland was not intended by the Taoiseach as a Trojan horse.
OK, Martina, just a quick thought on that. Do you agree with Mark Hennessy that that is how people are likely to see it in the South?
I think there's a lot of sense in what Mark is saying, but I think there's another question to consider, which is, do the prevailing arrangements serve the best interests of society on each side of the border, or could an improvement be effected? And Henry Ford said, you know, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. The Republic is has got a very high standard of living. Infrastructure's better, wages are higher, pensions are higher, the standard of living is higher. And you look across the border and you can see that it is not such a healthy society.
OK. Thank you very much, Martina. We're nearly out of time. I just want to squeeze Duncan Morrow in very quickly. Your thoughts, if you would, in 30 seconds on a shared Ireland versus a united Ireland versus a new Ireland.
I think a shared Ireland holds both of those potential concepts in space, but everybody, I hope, is trading ideas of what the shared island will look like. And I don't think there's a political inevitability at all in Micheál Martin's campaign. I think what he's trying to do is create somewhere in which people can live together and can think about all sorts of options for the future, but not necessarily in the absolute terms that we're hearing tonight.
Yeah. And do you think some unionists might be concerned that a shared island is a Trojan horse for a united Ireland, very quickly?
Well, there will certainly be some who do, because there are some, but many will not. And I think people like Ian, for example, will say, well, let's work with this.
All right, we've got to leave it there, folks. I wish we had another 20 minutes, but there you go. Thanks all very much indeed. That's it for tonight. I'll be back at the weekend with Sunday Politics at the later time of 11 o'clock on BBC One and iPlayer. For now, though, from all of us, thanks for watching. Good night.